Hi, and a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined us for this session of Data Science Under the Hood, in which we will be focusing on issues at the very intersection of data science and humanity with our speaker today, Professor Margot Brereton. Hi, Margot, how are you?
Hello, good, thanks, David. How are you?
Yeah, that's great. I'm very well. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's David Lovell. I'm Deputy Director of QUT Centre for Data Science. And before I properly introduce Margot, I just want to pay respect to the First Nations owners of the lands on which we're all standing, even though we're conducting this meeting online. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yugara as the First Nations owners of the lands on which QUT stands. I'd like to pay respect to the elders, laws, customs and creation spirits, and recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning, and say that QUT acknowledges the very important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QUT community. Look, it's an absolute delight to be introducing you today, Margot. You are an esteemed colleague and you're also a co-leader with me of the Data Focused Decision Making program here at QUT Centre for Data Science. And this seminar series, Data Science Under the Hood, is really about exploring important methods and techniques and concepts in data science. And for those of you who've not seen the series before, we invite an expert to share their insights and wisdoms so we can all be enlightened about a specific topic. And today's topic, human interaction with data, reminds us very much that we engage with data and with data science to deliver insights and understandings that will benefit humanity. And today's speaker, Professor Margot Brereton, is excellently placed to enlighten us on this, having a breadth and depth of experience in collaborative design or co-design of new humanitarian technologies and their interfaces. Margot's nationally and internationally recognised for her design work in support of people and communities in selected and sometimes quite challenging contexts. Her research has helped greatly increase the agency and improve futures for older people and people with intellectual disabilities. She's designed technologies to help people connect to nature, to help sustain Indigenous language use. Margot, welcome. I'm really looking forward to this. Are you happy to proceed?
Yeah, am I ready to go? Yep.
I think so. I can see your slides and everything. Right. And look, I guess as we go, I'll be monitoring the Q&A. So you might get questions as we go. You happy to take questions?
Yeah, and that'd be great because I don't think I can, in this mode, see the chat, and it's probably best I don't look at the chat. Hey, so no, but if you do, that would be good.
Yeah, stay focused. Take it away, Margot.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so I promised to talk about human interaction with data. And the subtitle of the talk is How Can We Stay Human in an Increasingly Data-Driven World? I trained as a mechanical engineer in all of my degrees. My last degree was in mechanical engineering design, but since then I spent a lot of time around anthropologists and have operated at the intersection between the human and the technological, and I have a focus on co-design, collaborative design with communities, and you'll see the nature of my talk will reflect that. So what I want today to discuss is data-focused narratives, data-centered versus human experience-centered approaches, how we can then move to perhaps data enabling conversation, thought and action. And I often think, I will argue that data often presents a very partial and narrow view and a constrained interactional frame. So I want to look at how we can move beyond constrained interactional frames. I'm going to start with a fairly old study, but a very nicely researched study about maternal mortality in Andhra Pradesh. And then I will look at some of our own work in our lab, working with older people and also with nature. And then finally, I'll move on to our newest work, which looks at radiology and supporting radiologists. And I will do that by using as a provocation autonomous vehicles, and how machine learning is applied in autonomous vehicles and how it's applied in radiology and how we might apply it in the future. So I'm going to start with fairly standard data entry, and then I'm going to move towards sensors and monitoring and the ways that data is being used at the moment. So I think the first thing that people often begin with is an idea of evidence-based practice. So first of all, we better get some data. Now, there's nothing unreasonable about this, if only we had the data. And this was certainly the approach that was taken in the informational challenge to achieve maternal mortality under the Millennium Development Goals 5. And this analysis is from Andhra Pradesh in India. It's the analysis was done by C.R. Ranjini, who was a student of anthropologist Lucy Suchman, and Sandeep Sahay, and a collaboration between Bangalore and Oslo. And the challenge for the Millennium Development Goals was to reduce maternal deaths in childbirth and increase the proportion of births attended by skilled health personnel. And so an information plan was developed, and it was rolled out at national, state and local levels. And this study was done at the state level in Andhra Pradesh. And the plan was to monitor whether facilities were providing signal care services, to record all deaths, to understand the cause, looking at obstetric history, distance from the institution, providing care provision, the type of housing that the family lived in, and so on. And the idea was that a health centre medical officer should audit every death, submit data sheets within 7 days to the district office through a web-based mortality information system. And after a quick pilot study, this mortality information system was rolled out to all 23 districts in the state. And this is what it looked like. So it's a standard web interface, and it asks for things like the history of the present pregnancy, fairly standard data items that you might expect, like place of delivery, who conducted the delivery, the date and time of onset of labor pains, duration of labor, the nature of the delivery, complications, date and time of delivery, condition of baby at birth, age of mother at time of delivery. Also the history of the pregnancy care, whether there were any complications within the pregnancy, and also details of death. So this was what the system looked like that was rolled out. And what happened? Well, there was massive under and non-reporting in this system. The field staff, instead of the doctors, submitted audit sheets, and many fields were left empty, even when the doctors submitted. It was scaled back from a 6-month to a 4-month trial. During the meantime, the government was voted out. The contract was terminated with the IT provider, and it completely fell into non-use. So what Ranjini and colleague did was they did an ethnographic study to try to understand what had happened in Andhra Pradesh. And here's what the doctors, the kinds of things that they said, and it points to the fact that they were very overworked and they were unable to get out to a lot of these rural communities in order to do this data collection. So the first one, a health worker has 10 to 20 villages in her jurisdiction, a tour scheduled for 20 days, and is expected to be at her sub-centre for 10 days. She can probably only visit a village once or twice a month. And when she next goes, she'll come to know about the deaths, but there's a huge possibility of her missing out on them. So there's non-reporting and under-reporting. Then the second one says, if there are 2 or 3 doctors at the health centre, then one can go on rounds to audit. But if I'm alone, I have to go, who will treat the patients here at the health centre? Also, some villages are very far. There's no vehicle, difficult to get there using transport and so on. So overall, the findings of the report were that people felt it was a very top-down approach. The health workers feared suspension by district authorities for dereliction of duties. So there was a lot of concern about whether recording a death or not recording a death would lead to some sort of recriminations. And there was also a feeling that there was a lot of focus on information gathering rather than information use. An ignorance of the practicalities of data entry, and that most of the information gathered would not actually be used for generation of indicators. And the overwhelming conclusion was data needs to be valued for its contribution to local action rather than as a tool for control and reprimand. So, here we are. I think what we have here is there's, whenever you have a sort of data-focused approach, there's always a narrative that goes with data-driven decision-making, whether it's about data for smart cities, gathering data for the ERA exercise in universities, you know, what's your H index and so on. There's a whole narrative about what the data will be used for, and then the data is a very sort of partial representation, and it's used to make decisions on. There's a relationship between the narrative between technology providers. Some people may really be pushing a data-focused approach, and then there's people's experiences. Well, how do people who have something to do with this data relate to this narrative and the technology? So I want to offer a sort of a contrasting idea here to do with that possibly rather than gathering data, we could give information, and it doesn't sound that plausible if you from the outset, if you're looking at what was going on in Andhra Pradesh. It really seemed a very reasonable plan to go and gather data. But here's another study from Lesotho in South Africa and Sierra Leone, where they had the Ebola crisis not many years ago. And this is by some co-designers, the late Gary Marsden and Maletsa Bisu Molapo. And they were concerned with a similar problem about rural maternal health care. And they had community health workers who would come to the healthcare centre. They would be educated using visual training materials like the ones that you can see above that were in manuals at the health centre. And then and they were educated by nursing sisters and health professionals. And then the job of the community health workers was to go out into the community and to do maternal health care. But there was concern about getting the right messages out to the community because many, because the community health workers were illiterate and they were all using particular local languages. There was concern about whether the messages would be relayed out properly. So they designed, as you can see, this little phone app below. And what happened was they had monthly training sessions. They designed an app where it was easy for the trainers who had low computer skills themselves to create these pages to put onto phones. So they would record in local language messages about what to do, and then when the community health workers would come to the centre, they'd transfer these messages through Bluetooth onto the mobile phones. But the outcomes were fabulous. From the trainer's perspective, their messages were getting directly to the mothers, and the information was being retained and passed on accurately to help get procedures right. But the community health workers as well, they really liked it because they could refer to it to counsel patients. And also they felt that phones with health content on them elevated their status in the community. So what I am suggesting here is that for these two different situations, one is about gathering data, and the other is about giving data and information. One is about trusting you, the provider, and giving you the data, and the other is about empowering the person with data. And so my suggestion too is that the second approach is much closer to the human experience of the users of this data. The mothers, the health workers, they're using this directly as a part of their experience. Whereas in the first study in Andhra Pradesh, the data is being gathered, and it's also with the intent of helping human experience, but you can tell that the human experience is much further removed from the act of gathering the data gathering, or all of the motivation that where does the data go, it all gets sent off somewhere else, and then you wait to get it back. So you're giving the data, but you're not necessarily getting anything back immediately. So I think, of course, they're two very different situations, but I think there's a possibility for hybrids. And I would suggest that the reason that the second approach worked better was because it was informed by an approach where they went and interviewed members of the healthcare centre, they observed and worked with them, they understood what was important to them, and then they designed something that they could use. Whereas the first system was thought about only from a data perspective of what data was needed.
Margot, could I just ask, you mentioned
yes,
in the first study that there was a pilot study done.
Yes.
And presumably that was promising enough for things to proceed, but perhaps the focus of that pilot study was misplaced, given how things turned out. Do you know anything about that aspect of it?
No, I don't, but I would suggest that it was perhaps more of a usability study of whether the website could be used than how it would be used in practice, and possibly more to do with what information doctors or health officials thought should be needed. So done more at that level than done at a local level.
Yeah. I'm mindful of time, but also do want to remind people that if there are questions that emerge on the way through, please use the Q&A and we'll find a point where we can try and address those.
Okay. So I don't want to suggest that the first approach is completely misplaced, but I do want to think about how do we bring human experience closer to the point of the data gathering. And so this is my third case study, and this is about smart homes monitoring the elderly. And this is something that just about every single tech company wants to do, I think, with the aging population. There's enormous interest in keeping older people out of hospital, supporting them to stay at home, and using a sort of a smart home concept of some sort to monitor the elderly. And you can see here there's a poor person who has fallen and they can't get up. but they are monitored, and through this monitoring, there is someone who will be alerted, and then they will presumably help will be sent. So I might just ask, is there anyone who wishes for a future like this in their own home? Or anyone who has something like this in their own home? And I can't sort of see the responses, but
actually,
yes, David.
If people open their participant panels,
Oh, they can put a hand up.
They can wave a hand, but due to technology interface issues, it might be a challenge to get that.
Well, look, I can say from working a fair bit with older adults and providing, often the people designing the tech are much younger, and they have a very much what we call an othering approach to older people. So they assume they're some sort of other. They don't ever imagine themselves being old, and they don't, and they tend to think of old people as being sort of frail and bumbly and incapable, and not having a similar personality even to when they were younger. Of course, I don't want to trivialize this issue. My own mother is 90, and she lives alone, and in the UK in lockdown, it's very significant and difficult circumstances, and there's a lot of reasons why you would apply this kind of approach. But what happens when you do is actually, first of all, as soon as there's a system in there, relatives ignore the older person more because there's something else to look after them. Another thing is that the data can be very hard to interpret, and there can be a lot of missed signals and erroneous signals. And it turns out that when people are alerted because the data has detected some sort of anomaly in movement pattern, or it usually is movement patterns, or opening the fridge or something, the older person gets a call and they have to account for what they were doing. So they have to start sort of accounting for the fact that they were painting the wall and so on. So they become viewed through the lens of their data. Some of them learn how, of course, to manipulate this, and when they want some attention, they'll do something that is strange. But the key concern is that this ignores much of what matters to older people by viewing them through this reduced data lens. The interfaces tend not to support older people to learn about themselves and their own health. And we call them a kind of, I don't know if you have ever watched Monty Python, but there's a scene where they think someone's dead and they're saying, "I'm not dead yet." And we call it "I'm not dead yet" technology. So we take a human experience-centered approach in this case. And there's a lovely photo essay by Gratian de Moustier all about a woman called Odile. And Odile says, home help and government aids are available, but if you take away habits from old people, you leave them with nothing. And the photo essay is all about her habits of cooking, making the bed, preparing the meal, and so on. And when we interviewed older people about what matters to them, and also if you look at all of the recommendations for how to age healthily, they point to social connection and physical activity. When we talk to older adults, we sought to understand what their desired habits and practices were. And actually at the time we were doing this, we were also really interested in the Internet of Things and how we might use things as interfaces rather than, because the Internet of Things at the time was being thought of for supply chain management. You know, the yogurt pot leaves the factory, goes to the shop, goes to the home, goes to the dump. But we know from a lot of socio-technical studies that objects are very important to people in the sort of actor networks that they're in. So for example, at work, you might gather around the water cooler or gather in the kitchen. If that room wasn't there, those gatherings wouldn't happen. So we're really interested in the objects that matter to older people and their habits and practices. And the one that kept coming up was to do with beverages and making tea and coffee. But also here's a computer here where it's covered with a dust cover and only used when it needs to be used. It's not always on. And often things like mobile devices, the screens are small, and there were a lot of reasons that our older participants didn't want to use Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, and so on. So we ended up designing this thing, and it's called a messaging kettle. And it's a pair of kettle mates. And you can see this big lava lamp-like glow happening here. This is in my kitchen in Brisbane, this setup. There's a kettle mate, and a tea box. Now, what happens when my mum puts her kettle on in the UK is that I can see that her kettle is boiling. And so we get this lava lamp-like glow in our kitchen. She has exactly the same setup in her kitchen in the UK. So she can see when our kettle is boiling and we're having a cup of tea. So that's the first thing, is that rather than treating the older person as a subject to be monitored, there's a sense of reciprocity here, that we each see when each other is having a cup of tea, and that might open a possibility for communication. Difficulty with the UK is that it's a 9-hour time difference. So typically people tend to sort of call maybe once a week, once a fortnight. And there's a very brief window when you can call from Australia between about 6 and 9 p.m, or it's too late there, or sorry, too late here or too early there. And if you only speak to someone once every week or two, it's a bit, you don't dare call for less than 20 minutes or it would seem a bit rude. And so you tend to sort of put off calling unless you're the kind of people who have a regular time to call. But there are all those difficulties with making these connections. And so we designed this system to get around that. You also see here this tea box, and what happens on the tea box is you can write a handwritten message. So this is, oh, here we go. This is it. This is in the UK. This is my mum's kitchen. So here we see at the other end, this light signifies that I have my kettle on in Australia. And my student Aloha Ambe studied the use of this messaging kettle. We deployed 4 pairs of messaging kettles, and we found that people express this sense of everyday togetherness, that they felt the presence of the other person in their house. Even though all this is of course a signal that the kettle's on. It's one data point, that's all it is, but it opens up a whole lot of meaning and interpretation, because I know, for example, that this is my mother's kitchen. It's the handwriting that I've always seen letters from her in, and so on. So it's a very different way of representing data, and it's representing data so that it can be immediately used and brings more meaning. And it's even sort of collaboratively habituated. Sometimes it breaks down, and This is me. Happy New Year, Ma. I think the kettle's fixed. And my mum, thank goodness, did Alessandro do it? So Alessandro at the time was a postdoc who was working on our project. He's now a senior lecturer in computer science. And you see sort of some of the interface here. The green light means we're both connected to the internet. If it's yellow, it means you're connected, but the other party isn't. If it's red, it means your connection's not working. So there's various ways that you can sort of debug what's going on here. And there's actually a drawer in here where you can put tea bags, which is very important as well. So when we think about data within human experience, we can increase communication and everyday togetherness, which means simple messages, you know, I just cooked spaghetti bolognese, I just spilt milk all over the floor, the kids are back from school, this sort of thing, instead of once a fortnight. It's not a broadcast medium, it's a presidential hotline. What is very nice is that I often hear my children saying, "Mom, Grandma's kettle's boiling." So her presence is sort of brought into the family home. Also, what this is doing is it's just detecting whether the kettle is hot. If I, for some reason, don't want my mum to know I'm having a cup of tea, I can just point it in the other direction. So you have complete agency over the data that you are giving. There, I just want to say, you know, are there ways that we can prioritize human experience and human agency over data gathering and machine-based interpretation? I think there is a possibility for both kinds of system to be at work. I know that especially as when dementia sets in, there are certain elements of automated systems that can potentially be very useful, but there are also a lot of ways in which you can engage more social interaction and agency for the people giving the data over their data. And I think that data that enables sort of conversation, thought, and action is in the immediate experience of the data is perhaps where we should be moving towards. I just will make a little pause there to see if anyone had a question they wanted to ask about this study.
Actually, Margot, there's been some questions raised in relation to the notion that you presented a little bit before for this study about trust and empowerment. And I think these are ideas that are very much in people's minds as we look at issues where data has been used in ways that the people providing the data would not have anticipated, or you know, thinking about scandals such as the use of Facebook data by Cambridge Analytica, and some other things. So trying to think how to establish this trust seems to be something that happens between people. Do you think there is the potential for that trust and empowerment to happen when data and people are sort of intersecting on a much larger scale? I can certainly understand, you know, with the system you just demonstrated there, that's a very sort of direct and meaningful connection between people. But does trust and empowerment scale, do you think?
No, I think it becomes
okay.
I think it becomes much more complex. In particular, because, for example, a lot of people, when they look at, say, a website, if they see the Myers brand on the website, that means they trust it, and yet it might be a complete spoof site. But people, the things that people trust are that they encounter within the human experience are quite easy to mask and shift. So I certainly, a recent study we've done with older people suggests that many of them don't like these sort of bigger social media or broader systems anyway, and they really do want systems that give more meaningful interaction rather than broader interaction, and that are within more limited circles. So in that case, the trust issues become more manageable, I suppose. But as soon as you have something with many layers and many, that's not something we have dealt with yet in our research, and I appreciate the complexities of it.
It reminds me of a comment a former colleague used to make, who was involved in marriage counselling, and he said, you know, how do you spell love? T-I-M-E, meaning that you have to invest time in a relationship for you know, that to be a loving one and a trusting one, and from there to be reciprocity there. So actually this is something that's just become clear for me, as you say now, that this trust issue, it doesn't scale so well. So yeah, thanks for highlighting that.
But yeah, well, thanks for raising it. I just want to talk a little bit about this because it's a bigger data, I suppose. This is Shiring Dema's work in Bhutan, looking at conservation of the critically endangered white-bellied heron. Makes that beautiful noise. And she did this very interesting study. It won the, actually I've put the freshwater biology site here, but she won best paper at eScience for this study. She used 3 different machine learning techniques and also looked at ground truth actual calls of the heron. And you know, what she did is she compared the number of false positives and negatives and so on. But what you can see here in this sort of brightly colored strip is a false color spectrogram that is a visual representation of the sound coming from the site. And I think what was really interesting here is that the recognizers are really useful, but the information is very abstracted. It's just, I think it's a heron or it's not. Whereas here you can see on the false color spectrogram, there's a box highlighted heron calls in this low frequency band. And then you can see further over to the right, a peculiar shrill sound, which was a heron stress call that none of the algorithms picked up because they weren't trained on it. It was a rarer event. But this really highlights the value of having using data to provoke conversation and to show the broader context as well as the more reduced context. They had all sorts of conversations around the data. And then another thing that often people think about is, oh, if only I had an app that could just recognize all sorts of bird sounds like Shazam for birds. And this is very difficult to do because bird songs aren't like pop songs. Every bird individual is different. There are different distances from the microphone, all sorts of complexities. But also, even if you did have an app on your phone and you could recognize a bird, it probably wouldn't, unless you were already really into birds, help you very much. So we've been quite interested in developing new kinds of interface for citizen science. And this one is one we call the ambient birdhouse. And what it does is just every 15 minutes, it plays a bird sound in your home of a local bird. And the idea is that you hear the bird and you look around to see what it is and you can see. Whereas usually birds you hear, but you can't see them, or you see, but you can't hear them. So you only know the ones, the really sort of obvious ones like crows and kookaburras and so on. And then we also had little RFID cards here.
What's that one? Quested pigeon.
So you can sort of tap your RFID card on the birdhouse to check that bird's sound. So this is a way of sort of putting nature sounds into the home And what we did find from this was that people were much more attentive to sounds outside the home because they had learned some sounds inside the home. And you'll see from this.
Was it a Yuki?
See, Yuki knows that that is a Teresian crow. So, whereas a lot of kids think it's an angry duck, actually. So, what we then did was during in Bhutan we put some of these soundscapes. So this ambient birdhouse in Bhutan, it had that ambient quality of being playable in the home, but it also let people search through soundscapes for the heron or the hornbill. They started wanting to look for other birds using sensor data from a local nest that the foresters have put up. So I think this is sort of through some of our design work, we're exploring ways that you can embed the data into a more human experience approach. So I just want to quickly go through my last case, if that's, but if there's any questions about that first, I'd be very happy to take some.
Actually, so we've had some reflections coming in. One from Owen Forbes, who's wondering whether, you know, incorporating mixed methods with, you know, some lived experience, qualitative experience, can help us in quantitative data collection. So, I mean, addressing this issue about trying to gather larger amounts of data, not but by engaging first with the groups that you're seeking to elicit data from. What would you say to that, Margot? What do you?
Well, I think usually the reason people do qualitative work, they do it more in the social sciences and the humanities, but yeah, usually the qualitative work is done because you don't yet understand enough about the situation. It's so highly multivariate. You don't know what to focus on. You don't know what to measure. So what qualitative work does is it gives you a much better indication of what you might measure that you could then base your quantitative you know, sensor measurements around and so on. So, and I think then some qualitative, for example, with the messaging kettle, the fact that people write messages, it gives you an idea of their activities. So that also complements the quantitative data measurement that you might be doing. So I definitely would advocate for a mixed methods approach.
And I think one thing that's coming through from the examples that you've just shared is situations where people are engaging with data and getting something from that engagement. There's that reciprocity coming through. So I'm curious to hear with your fifth case study, what's that got to say?
Well, look, I think people do actually love data. This is a really challenging one because, you know, real-time decision-making in cars is not easy. And that's probably why autonomous vehicles have a very constrained framing around human interaction. I mean, they basically treat humans as objects and then try to detect them. There was an accident in Arizona probably a couple of years back now. The difficulty with people detection, as I understand it, is that if you have a lot of pedestrians on the pavement or the sidewalk, you never know if one might jump out at any time. So if the car has to process all of that data about who they are and understand their intentions, it really can't. And that's probably why the self-driving car only had the capability to classify an object as a pedestrian if it was near a crosswalk or a crossing. The other thing was there were so many false positives being detected that they turned off the human identification system, and this is where the accident happened, where a pedestrian was hit and killed, which I'm sure you all remember. Of course, we know that I don't know if you saw the talk by Rod Brooks from the MIT robotics lab, but he used a slide very similar to this to point out that deep learning, of course, detects data features and not humans and things. So it probably would simple pictures that can't be recognized. For example, this black and yellow grid would be recognized as a school bus, even though it wasn't in cells. So it's really important to sort of remember that our algorithms, they're limited to recognizing data features. But I think the broader point that I want to make is that as engineers, we tend to create our own space in the world and work on the technical. And when people talk about autonomous vehicles, they talk about these 5 stages of automation that go from driver only through to fully automated. And if you look at number 4 here, highly automated, the vehicle handles all functions, but the driver is required to be able to take control. But the subtext of this is that while we're busy working on all the things we can automate from a data perspective, we are assuming that the human role is going to be as a monitor. And humans are really bad at monitoring. That's not part of a human skill set, is to sort of laboriously watch and correct for errors. So the point I want to make here is that we really should be thinking about what humans are good at, things like framing problems, what computers are good at, solving problems where there's masses of data that needs to be crunched. And we should really be looking to design systems that use both of the best of both worlds. Noor Tamares argues that that engineers are working in these constrained interactional frames where they're only thinking about what they can do with the data, and that this is a methodological deficiency because they're not testing the coexistence of the human and the car, that there's not nearly enough methods being worked on to think about how the human and the car engage. And as a result, there's this gap in articulating what alternative futures look like, and we're being fed this autonomy future. So I'll just quickly say that our latest grant is on human-machine synergistic learning, or teaming, in radiology. And radiology has been quite successful in its use of machine learning for detection of cancers by looking at hundreds of thousands of images, or probably other conditions as well. But there are some critiques of it. The radiologists tend not to like it. It doesn't use the radiology skills so well. It's very good at detecting things on which there is a lot of data to learn, but rare cases, of course, humans are probably better at detecting than machines. There is some indication that the health costs increase because more people are called back for routine checks because they get a false positive. There's some indication that radiologists are losing skills. But there's another really interesting system around called Radiopedia. And this is like the radiologist version of Wikipedia. And Radiopedia's mission is to create the best radiology reference the world has ever seen, making it free for all. And this is where radiologists share all their interesting cases and knowledge. So to cut a very long story short, our grant is about how do we bring together the best of these worlds. We've got so many images and so much data that can be learned from. You would not want to not take advantage of that opportunity. But also you've got radiologists with really fine skills, and can we not use the image data that we have to help radiologists learn and discuss? So we have a sort of preliminary idea about how we're going to address this, which is to do with human and machine dialogue, looking at the different ways that attention is drawn to things, that things are labeled, how people frame problems, the different biases, values, and affect that humans bring and that data brings. Well, data doesn't bring much affect, but the human choices, ethics, and agency. So bundled up in that framework, there's some wonderful design work research waiting to be done with radiologists, so that we can create more effective systems for students to learn radiology is the focus of the grant. So that's the end of my pitch. I think in human data interaction, we need to consider what data and machine learning does to people, the immediate human experience. We should be designing to extend what people can see and do, encourage new ways of knowing and learning with data, and empowering people more in their everyday lives, and try to expand our methods and our frames to consider human experience, aspirations, and empowerment, so that we design new relations between data and people.
Fantastic. Margot, that's really...
Thank you to all these people. That's it. Thank you.
That's wonderful and really thought-provoking. I'm mindful of the time that we have, and there's a question I want to put to you while my phone is ringing in the background. Could you go back one slide?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So just with respect to that last point there about expanding methods and frames to consider human experience, my question was really to pick your brains about methods or approaches that you could commend to us, or I say us, you could commend to people who are quite focused on the data side of things, maybe less focused on the human data interaction. What methods or approaches would you commend to us to help deliver data science solutions for greater human benefit? Are there particular things that you would suggest would be useful, practical steps in the right direction so that we can improve the impacts that we deliver through our work?
Yeah, I mean, I think the approach is to be aware of the tendencies. So the tendency is to know your tool set and to see how you can apply your tool set. And if your tool set is machine learning, or for example, it's often thinking about, okay, what are the techniques I could use? And it's asking the most limited questions to know, how do I go from what the expert knows to apply this tool? But I think there's opportunity for just a broader sort of a questioning and thinking, because often we're trying to optimize, for example, the machine learning algorithm to recognize a particular kind of data. But someone who has a lot of experience in that field may think about that data quite differently. And they might, for example, design not quite such good algorithm, but they might frame, or because they're not a machine learning person, but they might frame the problem much better, so that the algorithm would learn different things, and especially if there can be some sort of interactive aspect to that. I think there's really a lot of potential by expanding the frame a bit, thinking about how experts in their domain, the kinds of questions they want to ask, as well as the immediate problem to be solved. And also, with radiologists, we're wanting to understand, how they learn, how they share, all sorts of things like that as well.
Do you think some of these tendencies to focus on, technology in a narrow sense are driven by the fact that there's a desire to measure the impact that we're having, and some of the impacts that we want to have, such as, increased learning or a sense of agency, or, things like that, not that easy to measure? Do you think some of what we're doing is driven by that desire to measure our impact?
Well, yeah, I do actually, especially when you think about the way a lot of papers will claim their method is better over another method, will be that it's better on data from a certain data set. So if that is the way the evaluative measure is framed, then you're going to people are going to be tailoring their algorithm towards a very particular thing, and that may not necessarily, that data set may not represent the breadth of stuff that's seen in real life. I don't want to trivialize those issues because I'm not a data scientist, but I am an engineer. I was trained as an engineer, and I know, you know, the very good reasons we're trained in sort of abstraction and reductionism is to make problems feasible and representable and so on. So there's very good reason for that. But actually, probably oftentimes just more work needs to be done at the interface and thinking about how you can frame the problem differently so that you're applying the techniques to a better framed problem. I think that's perhaps also what needs to happen.
Margot, we're going to have to draw things to a close, and as I anticipated, there's plenty more discussion to be had. So we'll have to think about ways to have you back to talk some more about this. Look, I want to thank you for sharing your experience, expertise, and insights with us. It's been a really fascinating and thought-provoking seminar, exactly what we want from the Data Science Under the Hood series, for which I want to thank the Centre for Data Science at QUT for hosting. Also want to give a special shout out to our colleague Amy Rawson for doing the technical support and brilliant work behind the scenes. Look, this is an ongoing series. We will have more and different talks to look forward to. But for the time being, I'm going to bid you all farewell and look forward to the next time we catch up at this session. Thanks, everyone. Take care now.
Thanks,
Bye.
David. Thank you all for coming.